The avoidant person is experiencing complete psychological breakdown in response to your silence, your absolute absence of communication, your refusal to engage with their attempts to reach out or to provide the closure or the reaction or the continued connection they expected you'd provide even after the relationship ended. And this crashing out, this dismantling of their psychological stability, this unraveling of their carefully maintained composure is happening, specifically because your silence eliminates every defensive strategy they have, removes every psychological escape route they typically use to manage discomfort, denies them the emotional reaction they were prepared to handle, and leaves them instead with complete void they cannot fill or control or manipulate or rationalize away. The avoidant person's entire defensive system is designed to manage known threats. They can handle anger by dismissing it as overreaction. They can handle pursuit by using it to validate their desirability while maintaining distance. They can handle emotional expressions by framing them as evidence the other person is too needy or too unstable. They can handle confrontation by defending themselves or by shifting blame or by withdrawing further until the confrontation subsides. But your silence provides none of these manageable responses. Your silence is absence of data, void where they expected reaction, complete withdrawal that mirrors their own withdrawal, but proves far more devastating when experienced from the receiving end. Mystery they cannot solve because you're providing no information to analyze or interpret or defend against. This silence is crashing them out because it forces them to sit with themselves without distraction of managing your reactions, without comfort of knowing you're still emotionally engaged, even if hurt or angry, without the control that comes from being able to predict and respond to your behavior. Your silence means they don't know what you're thinking, don't know if you hate them or are indifferent, don't know if you're suffering or thriving, don't know if you think about them or have moved on completely, don't know if reconciliation is possible or if the door is permanently closed, don't know if their patterns destroyed something that could have been repaired or destroyed something irreplaceable that's gone forever. This not knowing, this complete absence of information, this void where they expected some form of continued engagement creates psychological crisis that their defensive system cannot manage because all their defenses are designed to handle known threats, and your silence is unknown, is absence, is nothing to defend against, and everything to fear simultaneously. The specific ways your silence is dismantling their psychological stability. The avoidant person's psychological stability is being actively dismantled by your silence through specific mechanisms that target the foundations of their defensive system and their sense of control. Understanding these specific mechanisms reveals why silence is more destructive to their stability than any other response could have been. Your silence is dismantling their stability by eliminating all information about your emotional state, creating anxiety-producing uncertainty their mind cannot resolve through its usual analytical strategies. The avoidant manages anxiety through analysis and understanding. If they understand what someone is thinking or feeling, they can strategize responses, can predict behavior, can maintain sense of control. But your silence eliminates information. They don't know if you're heartbroken or relieved. They don't know if you miss them or have forgotten them. They don't know if you're angry or indifferent. This complete absence of information creates anxiety. Their mind tries desperately to resolve by generating theories, imagining scenarios, analyzing what your silence might mean. But without data, every theory is equally plausible and equally unverifiable. Their mind is caught in loop of generating theories they cannot confirm or eliminate, creating ongoing anxiety that intensifies rather than resolves, because silence continues to provide no information that would allow resolution. Your silence is dismantling their stability by denying them opportunity to defend themselves or to control the narrative about what happened. The avoidant needs to maintain particular narrative about the relationship and its ending, narrative that protects their self-image, that justifies their patterns, that frames them as reasonable person who made understandable choices. If you were communicating, if you were expressing hurt or anger or disappointment, they could defend against your version of events, could present their counter-narrative, could work to control how the ending is understood by you and potentially by others. But your silence eliminates this opportunity. You're not providing narrative for them to argue against. You're not making accusations they can defend themselves from. You're simply gone, without explanation, without engagement, without giving them opportunity to shape the narrative. This leaves them with their own narrative, but without ability to know whether you accept it or have entirely different interpretation they cannot access or challenge. Your silence is dismantling their stability by forcing them to experience abandonment from the outside, rather than controlling it from the inside, as their patterns are designed to ensure. The avoidance patterns are specifically designed to prevent experiencing abandonment passively. They leave first. They create distance before others can. They control the separation to avoid being the one who is left. This control over abandonment is crucial to their psychological stability because it means they're never powerless in the face of loss, never in the vulnerable position of being the one left behind. But your silence means they're experiencing exactly what their patterns are designed to prevent. They didn't control this separation. They didn't choose this distance. They're the one who has been left. They're in the powerless position of wanting contact that you're denying. This reversal, experiencing abandonment from the receiving end when their entire defensive system is built to prevent this, creates crisis their defenses aren't equipped to manage because the defenses were designed to create abandonment, not to cope with experiencing it. Your silence is dismantling their stability by making them realize they want your attention and engagement more than they want their defended independence. The avoidant maintains stability through belief that they want independence more than connection, that being alone is preferable to vulnerability of relationship, that their defended isolation is chosen preference rather than fearful retreat. But your silence reveals the falseness of this belief. They want you to reach out. They want you to break the silence. They want your attention and engagement, even if that engagement is angry or hurt. This wanting, this desperate desire for your contact, contradicts their entire self-narrative about preferring independence. Discovering they want connection more than they want, defended isolation destabilizes their self-understanding, proves their defended independence isn't authentic preference, but is defense mechanism they'd abandon if they could have connection without the vulnerability it requires. Your silence is dismantling their stability by creating space where they cannot avoid confronting their patterns and their responsibility without your presence as distraction. When you were present or when you were communicating, the avoidant could focus on managing your reactions, on defending themselves to you, on dealing with relationship dynamics, all of which provided distraction from having to sit with their own patterns and their own responsibility. But your silence eliminates this distraction. They're alone with themselves, with their patterns, with their responsibility for the ending. There's no one to defend themselves to, no relationship dynamics to manage, no your behavior to focus on. This forces confrontation with themselves and with what their patterns cost them without the usual distractions that allow avoiding this confrontation. The sustained self-confrontation without external distraction is destabilizing because it makes avoiding awareness of their patterns impossible. Your silence is dismantling their stability by proving they've lost control over you and over the dynamic between you in ways that threaten their need for control. The avoidant maintains stability through sense of control, controlling their emotions, controlling relationship dynamics, controlling others' access to them, but your silence proves they have no control over you. They cannot make you respond. They cannot control whether you engage. They cannot influence your choices about contact. This loss of control is destabilizing because control has been their primary mechanism for managing anxiety and maintaining safety. Without control, without ability to influence you or to predict your behavior, they're in a state of powerlessness that their system cannot tolerate comfortably. The recognition that they're powerless to break your silence or to restore contact unless you choose to allow it destabilizes their sense of agency and control. Your silence is dismantling their stability by preventing the resolution or closure they need to move forward psychologically. The avoidant needs some form of resolution to move forward, either reconciliation that restores the relationship or clear ending with closure that allows them to process the loss and move on. But your silence provides neither. The relationship is ended, but without closure. Reconciliation might be possible, but you're not available to discuss it. Everything is in limbo, unresolved, ambiguous. This lack of resolution keeps them psychologically stuck, unable to fully grieve because they don't have definitive ending, unable to maintain hope for reconciliation because you're completely absent. The psychological limbo created by silence without resolution prevents forward movement and keeps them trapped in an unresolved state that becomes increasingly destabilizing over time. Your silence is dismantling their stability by making your absence and your indifference more real and more final than any angry or hurt communication would have made them. If you were angry, if you were hurt, if you were communicating pain or disappointment, it would mean you were still emotionally engaged, still affected by them, still caring enough to feel something. This would be painful, but would also be validating. They'd matter enough to hurt you, would be significant enough to generate strong emotions. But your silence suggests possible indifference, possible complete moving on, possible state where you're not thinking about them at all. This possibility that you're not angry or hurt, but simply done and indifferent, is more destabilizing than emotional reaction would be because it suggests they've become completely irrelevant rather than remaining significant, even negatively. The fear that your silence means complete indifference destabilizes their sense of having mattered at all. Why silence affects them more catastrophically than any words could have. The avoidant person's catastrophic response to your silence is specifically more severe than their response to any words you could have spoken. Understanding why silence is more devastating than verbal communication reveals the psychological mechanisms that make absence more powerful than presence in this context. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words because it provides no specific content to defend against, leaving them without target for their defensive strategies. If you send angry message, the avoidant could defend against the specific accusations, could rationalize the specific complaints, could argue against the specific interpretations. Their defensive system is highly effective at managing specific criticisms. They can minimize, they can reframe, they can shift blame for particular accusations. But silence provides no accusations to defend against, no specific complaints to minimize, no interpretations to argue with. There's nothing concrete to deploy their defenses against. This leaves their defensive system activated, but with no target, creating psychological tension where they're ready to defend, but have nothing to defend against, leaving them exposed to their own thoughts and feelings without the distraction of defending themselves to you. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words, because words would confirm you're still emotionally invested, while silence suggests possible complete emotional detachment. The avoidant can handle you being angry, hurt, disappointed, because these emotions prove they still matter to you. Prove you're still invested enough to have strong feelings. Even negative emotions are validating because they confirm significance, but silence provides no confirmation of emotional investment. Your silence could mean you're so hurt you can't speak, or it could mean you've moved on completely and aren't thinking about them. This ambiguity about whether you care at all is more destabilizing than certainty that you care enough to be angry. The possibility that your silence represents complete emotional detachment rather than suppressed emotional reaction threatens their sense of having been significant, creates fear that they're already irrelevant rather than being person you're angry at but still thinking about. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words because it forces them to project meaning onto absence rather than reacting to present content. When you communicate with words, the avoidant reacts to what you say. They might disagree or defend themselves, but they're reacting to actual content you provided. But with silence, there's no content to react to. Their mind must fill the void by projecting meaning onto your silence, by imagining what you might be thinking or feeling. This projection is more destabilizing than reacting to words because it reveals their own fears and insecurities. What they imagine about your silence reflects their own psychological state more than reality of your state. They're forced to confront their own fears about what you might think, their own insecurities about how you might see them, their own worst imaginings about the permanence of the loss, all without any external reality to confirm or deny these projections. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words, because it denies them the supply they're accustomed to receiving from your attention and engagement. The avoidant, despite their claims of wanting distance, actually received consistent supply from your attention and engagement throughout the relationship. Your pursuit validated their desirability. Your trying validated their importance. Your emotional investment validated their significance. Even negative attention is attention, is supply, is confirmation of mattering. But silence denies all supply. You're not pursuing, not trying, not investing emotionally in ways they can observe. This complete withdrawal of supply creates void the avoidance ego struggles with intensely. They're accustomed to mattering enough to receive your attention, and sudden complete absence of attention creates supply crisis that destabilizes their sense of importance and desirability. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words because it cannot be responded to, leaving them powerless in dynamic where they're accustomed to having responses available. If you send message, they can respond. They can apologize, explain, defend, argue, whatever they choose. This ability to respond gives them agency, gives them power to influence dynamic. But they cannot respond to silence. There's nothing to respond to. They're left completely powerless to engage, to influence, to affect the situation through their responses. This powerlessness is more destabilizing than any difficult conversation would be, because difficult conversations at least offer opportunity to engage and to influence through their responses, while silence offers no such opportunity and leaves them completely without agency. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words because it's sustained condition rather than discrete event they could process and move past. If you sent angry message, it would be discrete event. They'd read it, react to it, process it, and eventually the immediate impact would fade. But silence is ongoing condition. It's not something that happened that they can process. It's continuing state they're living in. Every day the silence continues is new experience of your absence, new confrontation with your unavailability, new evidence of your sustained choice to not engage. This sustained, ongoing nature of silence means there's no processing and moving past, because the silence itself continues, creating chronic stress rather than acute event that can be processed and relegated to past. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words because it makes them experience what they put you through. creating empathy and recognition they avoided while inflicting similar treatment on you. The avoidant withdrew from you repeatedly, went silent after intimacy, created distance without explanation. But experiencing silence from your end makes them understand how their withdrawal and silence affected you in ways they couldn't understand when they were the one creating the silence. This forced empathy, experiencing from receiving end what they inflicted on you, is destabilizing because it creates uncomfortable recognition of what their patterns actually do to people who care about them. They cannot avoid recognizing that what they're feeling now, the anxiety of silence, the pain of absence, the powerlessness of not being able to make someone engage, is what you felt when they employed these same tactics, and this recognition makes their pattern's impact undeniable. Silence affects them more catastrophically than words, because it communicates finality and decisiveness that words always leave room to debate or negotiate. Words can be argued with, negotiated with, responded to in ways that might change your mind or open dialogue. There's always possibility that words are opening to conversation rather than final statement. But silence communicates something more absolute. Your silence says this is done in ways that don't invite debate or negotiation. You're not engaging because the time for engagement is over. This finality communicated through absence rather than through stated words is more absolute because it's not declarative statement that could be revisited, but is enacted reality that you're maintaining through your continued silence. The enacted finality of silence is more destabilizing than spoken finality because it's not words that could be taken back, but is sustained choice you're demonstrating daily. How your silence is forcing confrontations. They cannot escape through their usual defenses. The avoidant person's usual defensive strategies are rendered ineffective by your silence, forcing them to confront realities they would normally avoid through their established defensive mechanisms. Understanding how silence forces unavoidable confrontations reveals why they're crashing out, rather than managing the situation with their typical defensive composure. Your silence forces confrontation with how much they actually need you by removing the person they didn't realize they were depending on emotionally. The avoidant maintained belief throughout the relationship that they didn't need you, that they were self-sufficient, that your presence was nice, but not necessary. This belief was sustainable while you were present because they never had to test it. You were there providing emotional support, stability, meaning, connection that they received but didn't acknowledge needing. Your silence forces confrontation with the truth. They were depending on you profoundly. Without you, they're struggling emotionally, feeling unstable, lacking purpose and meaning they didn't realize you were providing. This confrontation with their dependence on you contradicts their entire self-narrative about not needing anyone and destabilizes their defended independence by proving it was illusion, maintained by your presence, not reality that can sustain in your absence. Your silence forces confrontation with their patterns and their responsibility by removing the option to focus on your behavior or your reactions instead of their own. When you were present or communicating, the avoidant could focus on your behavior, your reactions, your needs, your responses, as distraction from examining their own patterns. They could frame problems as relationship issues, requiring both people to change, rather than as their patterns requiring their work. But your silence eliminates your behavior as focus. You're not doing anything. You're not reacting. You're not making demands. There's nothing about your behavior to focus on or to problematize. This forces them to confront that their patterns are the issue, that their behavior drove you away, that they bear responsibility for the ending without ability to distribute blame by pointing to your behavior or your contributions to problems. Your silence forces confrontation with the permanence and reality of loss by denying them the contact that would make you feel somewhat still present in their life. The avoidant can avoid fully confronting loss through maintaining some connection, occasional texts, being friends, staying in minimal contact. This minimal contact prevents full confrontation with loss by keeping the person somewhat present. But your complete silence forces confrontation with total loss. You're completely gone. You're not somewhat present. They cannot avoid confronting the fullness of your absence because there's no minimal contact to create illusion of your partial presence. This forces them to feel the complete loss rather than managing it through maintaining thread of connection, and complete loss is more devastating and more real than partial loss they could minimize. Your silence forces confrontation with their vulnerability and their lack of control by placing them in powerless position without defensive strategies available to restore power. The avoidant typically manages vulnerability through control, controlling distance, controlling information, controlling their own reactions. But your silence places them in completely vulnerable position without control. They cannot control whether you respond. They cannot control what you think. They cannot control the outcome. And they have no defensive strategy that restores control over you or over situation. This forces confrontation with vulnerability and powerlessness. Their defenses are designed to prevent, leaves them experiencing the exact states their defensive system exists to avoid without any defensive tool that can eliminate or manage these uncomfortable states. Your silence forces confrontation with what you meant to them by removing you completely and revealing the void your presence filled. The avoidant could minimize your importance while you were present by focusing on relationship difficulties, on discomforts your presence created, on what they were sacrificing to be with you. But your complete absence reveals what you are providing by the void your absence creates. They notice the hole in their daily life, the lack of person to share with, the absence of meaning and purpose you provided, the missing emotional support and stability. Your silence forces confrontation with what you meant to them by making your importance obvious through the devastation your absence creates. They cannot minimize your importance when the evidence of your importance is present in every aspect of their life that feels empty without you. Your silence forces confrontation with possibility that they've permanently lost someone irreplaceable by denying them information about whether reconciliation might be possible. If you were communicating anger or hurt, the avoidant could maintain hope that with time or apology or changed behavior, reconciliation might occur. But your silence provides no information about whether door is open or closed permanently. This ambiguity forces confrontation with possibility that loss is permanent, that you're irreplaceable, that they've destroyed something they'll never recover. The confrontation with permanent loss is more destabilizing than certain loss because certain loss can be grieved and processed, while ambiguous loss that might be permanent keeps them in sustained state of uncertain grief that prevents psychological resolution. Your silence forces confrontation with their own aloneness. Without the buffer of your presence they didn't realize was buffering their isolation. The avoidant maintained relationship with you while believing they preferred solitude. That alone was their natural state. But your silence reveals that you were buffering their isolation, providing connection that made defended independence tolerable rather than unbearably lonely. Without you, they're confronting their isolation without buffer. The defended independence that felt comfortable with you, occasionally present, feels like prison without you. This confrontation with unbuffered isolation reveals that their preference for alone was sustainable only because alone wasn't actually complete alone, but was independence buffered by your periodic presence. Your silence forces confrontation with their longing for connection. They've spent their life defending against, by creating circumstance where they desperately want contact, but cannot have it. The avoidant defended against longing for connection by never allowing themselves to fully want connection that wasn't available. But your silence creates circumstance where they desperately want contact with you, want you to respond, want you to reach out, want you to break the silence, and they cannot have it because you're not providing it. This forces confrontation with their longing, with their desire for connection, with their need for relationship they've denied their entire life. Experiencing desperate wanting for connection, they cannot have breaks through the defensive structure that prevented them from fully feeling their longing for connection. And fully feeling this longing is destabilizing because it contradicts their entire self-understanding as person who doesn't need or want deep connection. What their crash-out response to your silence means for your power and healing. The avoidant person's dramatic crash-out response to your silence has specific implications for your understanding of your own power and for your healing process. Understanding what their response means helps you recognize the effectiveness of your boundaries and helps you maintain those boundaries despite any attempts they make to break your silence. Their crash-out response means your silence is more powerful than any words you could have used, validating the wisdom of your choice to disengage completely. You might have questioned whether silence was right choice, whether you should have expressed your feelings in final message, whether you should have provided closure or explanation. But their crash-out proves silence was most powerful choice you could have made. Words would have given them content to defend against, reactions to manage, opportunity to engage. Silence gave them nothing to work with and everything to fear. The effectiveness of silence proved through their crash-out validates your choice and proves that sometimes the most powerful response is no response, that absence can communicate more effectively than presence, that what you don't say can be more impactful than what you do say. Their crash-out response means you've successfully reversed the power dynamic where you were pursuing and they were controlling through withdrawal. Throughout the relationship, the power dynamic favored them. You pursued, you tried, you worked to maintain connection while they controlled through withdrawal and distance. But your silence has completely reversed this. Now, they're the one dealing with your withdrawal, experiencing what it's like to want contact they cannot have, feeling powerless to make you engage. This reversal is evidence of your power, of your successful boundary enforcement, of your reclamation of agency and dynamic, where you were previously the one experiencing powerlessness. Their crash-out proves you're now in position of power through your maintenance of boundaries they cannot break. Their crash-out response means they recognize they've lost something valuable in ways they didn't recognize while you were available, confirming your worth. The intensity of their crash-out proves they understand they've lost something important, something valuable, something they cannot replace or recover. This recognition of your value through its absence confirms you were never the problem, were never too much, were never less valuable than they suggested. Your worth is being proven through the devastation your absence creates. Their crash-out is validation of your significance, confirmation that you mattered profoundly, even when their behavior didn't communicate this. This recognition of your worth, through their response to losing it, should strengthen your confidence in your value and in your decision to leave. Their crash-out response means your boundaries are effectively protecting you from continued engagement in toxic dynamic, validating the necessity of maintaining those boundaries. The fact that maintaining silence is causing them to crash out might make you feel guilty, or might tempt you to break silence to alleviate their suffering. But their crash out is evidence that your boundaries are working exactly as they should. They're preventing you from being pulled back into dynamic that hurt you. They're creating consequences for patterns that destroyed the relationship. They're protecting you from continued investment in someone whose patterns create suffering. The crash out proves The boundaries are necessary and effective, validating your choice to maintain them, despite any guilt or any urge to break silence. Their crash-out response means any future reach-out from them will likely be motivated by their panic and discomfort rather than by genuine transformation requiring extreme caution. When avoidants crash out, they often reach out in desperation, sending messages, making promises, expressing feelings they couldn't express before. But their crash out proves these reach outs are motivated by their inability to handle your silence, by their panic about the loss, by their discomfort with consequences they're experiencing. These motivations don't predict lasting change or genuine transformation. The crash out creates temporary crisis that might motivate temporary change behavior, but without sustained therapeutic work, patterns typically reassert once crisis passes. If they reach out, their crash out means you should be extremely cautious. Recognizing their motivation is managing their crisis, not demonstrating genuine capacity development. Their crash-out response means your healing is enhanced by maintaining silence that keeps you from being pulled back into their drama and chaos. The crash-out proves that engaging with them would mean engaging with someone in crisis, someone whose stability is compromised, someone who would likely draw you into their chaos in ways that would interrupt your healing. Maintaining silence protects your healing by keeping you separate from their crash-out, by preventing you from taking responsibility for managing their crisis, by allowing you to continue your forward movement without being pulled back into drama that would re-traumatize you or would delay your progress. The crash out is further evidence that staying away is serving your healing. Their crash out response means you're learning that maintaining boundaries despite others' negative reactions is possible and is powerful, strengthening your capacity for future boundary enforcement. Watching them crash out in response to your boundaries while you maintain those boundaries despite their response is teaching you that you can enforce boundaries even when others react badly, that others' emotional responses to your boundaries are not your responsibility, that maintaining boundaries despite pressure or guilt is possible and is powerful. This learning strengthens your capacity for boundary enforcement in future relationships. You've proven to yourself you can maintain boundaries with someone you care about, can hold firm despite their crash out, can prioritize your well-being over their comfort. This capacity will serve you in all future relationships. Their crash out response ultimately means your silence has created the most powerful consequence their patterns have ever faced, potentially creating catalysts for genuine change if they choose to use it that way, or simply serving as appropriate consequence if they don't. The crash out proves your silence has affected them more profoundly than any previous consequence they've faced for their patterns. This level of impact could potentially motivate genuine change, could drive them to therapy, could force confrontation with their patterns that leads to real work. Or it could simply be painful consequence they sit with without choosing growth. Either way, the consequence is appropriate and is more powerful than any consequence you could have created through remaining engaged. If they choose growth, your silence will have been catalyst. If they don't choose growth, your silence will have been appropriate consequence. Either way, your silence serves its purpose of creating impact their patterns haven't faced before, while protecting you from continued engagement that would have hurt you. They're crashing out. You're healing and moving forward. Their crash out is theirs to manage through seeking help or through continuing their patterns and facing continued consequences. Your silence is yours to maintain, protecting your peace, enforcing your worth, demonstrating your power, teaching you that you can hold boundaries even when others struggle with those boundaries, freeing you from responsibility for managing their crisis or their patterns or their response to experiencing consequences for the first time in ways they cannot escape or defend against or minimize away.